Great, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Steve McLeod. I'm the outgoing president for the Coastal Society, speaking with you today from a very icy Buffalo, New York. Thank you for joining this session of TCS's Coastal Connections web conference series. The trending topic we will be covering today is the National Marine Sanctuary Program, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. Our guest presenters from the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries will discuss the history, value, challenges, and rewards of the program, and they will also highlight the diversity of the program as reflected in a few of the currently proposed sanctuaries. Please note that the session is being recorded and the recording will be posted on the TCS YouTube channel in the coming days. For our non-member guests, the Coastal Society is a nonprofit organization founded in 1975 with a mission of fostering dialogue and advancing education to promote the wise use of our coastal resources. You can learn more about TCS and become a member at www.thecoastalsociety.org. The Coastal Connection series is meant to better connect TCS members and guests from the coastal community throughout the year. Our intent is not just to learn from our terrific guest panelists, but also to see and hear from you, our other participants, during the Q&A discussion period later in the session. We encourage you to turn on your camera and share your questions and thoughts at that time. Special thanks to Ashley Gordon and Melanie Perello for their support in organizing and running this session. Ashley, are there any other logistical points you would like to make?
Thanks, Steve. No, I think that that pretty much covers everything. And I'll just note too for questions, we'll hold questions until the end after our presentations, but please feel free to add them into the chat as they come to mind.
Okay, great, thank you. Now I am happy to introduce our first presenter and moderator for today's session, LeAnn Brody. As the Great Lakes Regional Coordinator for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, LeAnn works with Great Lakes communities on new sanctuary designations and nominations. She coordinates programs for the National Marine Sanctuaries and builds partnerships with other government agencies and organizations. LeAnn is leading the designation for the proposed Lake Ontario National Marine Sanctuary and is a Sanctuary Advisory Council Coordinator for the proposed Hudson Canyon Sanctuary. LeAnn spent her first 9 years with NOAA in Washington, D.C. in the National Coastal Management Office, focusing on the Great Lakes. She's based in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab. LeAnn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I used to work for Jeff Benoit. It's great to see you, Jeff. Well, thanks. So you gave a very good overview of what we're covering today. I think before we get started, I will turn it over to my colleagues, who I'm very grateful that they're joining today, Paul, Michel, and LeAnn Hogan. So Paul, can you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Paul Michel here. I'm the Regional Policy Coordinator for the West Coast region of National Marine Sanctuaries in Monterey, California. I've been in this position a couple of years. Prior to that, I was the Monterey Bay Superintendent for about 14 years. And prior to that, I was with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for many, many years, doing similar work, coastal work, oceans, wetlands, estuaries type work. So happy to be here. Looking forward to today. Thanks.
LeAnn.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm LeAnn Hogan. I am in the Eastern region of the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries with LeAnn, but I am based in Silver Spring, Maryland. I am the Regional Operations Coordinator, also leading the designation of the proposed Hudson Canyon National Marine Sanctuary. And before coming to sanctuaries, I spent 14 years at NOAA Fisheries. So, and then came to sanctuaries to the Eastern region. Thanks.
All right, well, let's get started. Next slide, please. So as Steve mentioned, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary, as did the Coastal Zone program. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to reflect on our accomplishments and really, think ahead to where we're going. And I think, The second part of our presentation will focus on the new sites that were designated and what that means for like how our program has evolved. But first, I just wanted to give a little bit of history, which is something that I typically don't do. Next slide, please. But in light of the anniversary, I think it was interesting for me to go back and look at this. So starting in the 1960s, when the Johnson administration commissioned the Science Advisory Council to evaluate the oceans. And this commission ended up calling for a system of marine wilderness preserves. But it was the Stratton Commission in 1969, which also had recommendations for coastal management, that really pointed out the value of marine sanctuaries and that they should be established to protect and manage endangered areas. So next slide. So as so often happens with policymaking, it was a catastrophe, in this case, the Santa Barbara oil spill, that really brought attention to threats to the ocean and people's livelihoods. In this period of February to April of 1969, the commercial fishing was completely shut down. The economic effects were pretty substantial from loss of income and loss of recreational facilities. Next slide. But so in 1972, the act was passed, National Sanctuaries Act, and this coincided with so many other pieces of environmental legislation, including the Coastal Zone Management Act. Next slide. So ironically, it was not the Channel Islands that was first designated, but in 1973, the USS Monitor was discovered off the coast of North Carolina. And in 1974 became our first national marine sanctuary. Next. And then following in 1980, the Channel Islands did become designated as our first West Coast sanctuary. Next slide. So the next 15 years were really instrumental in building out our system. Between 1981 and 1994, 9 of our sanctuaries were designated. And at that point, it felt like a lot of new sanctuaries. So our program ended up putting a hold on new designations. So in effect, we canceled what was called our site evaluation list, and didn't have the ability to consider new designations. We did designate the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary and Lake Huron in 2000, but that was a holdover from that initial site evaluation list. And then in 2014, we reconsidered how we should consider new sanctuaries, and we'll go over that because it really is a different approach to what we did in the initial building the system. Next slide. Okay, so our sanctuary system at this point covers more than 620,000 square miles of ocean and Great Lakes waters. The network keeps expanding through a number of ways. Next slide. So this map does change. This is our most current map. We seem to have an increasing number of yellow boxes that represent new sanctuaries. But I think what I like to point out in these slides is that every sanctuary is different. Every place is different. Every place is special. So when we consider a new sanctuary, we don't apply the same, template to every place. Obviously, we have, like Hawaiian Island Humpback Whale Sanctuary is a different place than Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and it's a strength of our program that we do look at each place individually. There's no standard size. There's no, standard resource that we protect. Next slide. Okay, so we have basically 4 mandates or 4 areas that we focus on. The first is resource protection, and we do this through both regulatory and non-regulatory approaches. Regulations are, designed to address activities that are causing threats to sanctuary resources. The non-regulatory might be education programs. It might be placing mooring buoys as a way to, minimize the impact on resources. But every sanctuary does have sanctuary regulations. The research and monitoring is just fundamental to how we better understand what we're doing in terms of assessing changes over time. I think we found that sanctuaries are places where researchers like to come, so we're able to attract quite a bit of interest in assessing our sanctuaries. I absolutely have a passion for our education and outreach programs. Given that sanctuaries are all, underwater, sometimes it's challenging for us to engage directly with people and to get to people to think about and care. So our program puts, a lot of emphasis on reaching people who may never, get out into a national marine sanctuary. And then community engagement, and I'll come back to this, several times, because this also is fundamental to how we do our jobs well. We need to work with the communities in the places where we are. We need to hear their ideas. They're the ones who are on the ground, directly experiencing, opportunities and issues. Next slide. So I have to mention the sanctuary advisory councils because every sanctuary has one, and we have a couple pre-designation advisory councils that bring together a variety of interests at the same table. Time after time, they have proven to be very influential and helpful to us in giving advice. And while they are limited to advisory, it's really a core value of our program to really, carefully listen to and work with these council members. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Paul and LeAnn. I originally called these like making a difference, but we wanted to point out just a couple scenarios where, where we've made a difference, or, highlighting a couple of accomplishments. So, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. So as Ellen mentioned earlier, science is the underpinning of all we do. NOAA is a science-based agency. So sanctuaries explore and discover as part of a broad, comprehensive research and monitoring program, most often through and with partners that can get us to certain places where we can on our own, like to the deep ocean. And I thought of a couple of great examples to share with you from the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary that highlight some really cool exploration and discovery. So in October of 2018, while exploring the Davidson Seamount, which is an area about 70 or 80 miles offshore of the little coastal towns of Cambria and San Simeon on the central coast of California, if you're familiar with that area, we had gone to the Davidson Seamount half a dozen times before, really exploring more the water column and the top of the seamount. And this was an exploration to see more at what's going on at the base of this seamount. It's a huge underwater mountain, like the size of Mount Shasta. It's pretty spectacular. It rises up off the seafloor from about 9,000 feet deep to within about 3,000 or 4,000 feet of the surface. And it's really cool when you go out there, you're getting close, because all of a sudden you see this just abundance of wildlife. The seabirds on the surface, there's whales feeding at the surface, porpoises, dolphins. So that there's something special down below. Anyway, we were down searching around at the base of the seamount, and we came across this area just covered with deep sea octopus. Really never would have guessed that they'd be there, because the water temperature's just above freezing. It's around 34, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, really too cold for even these hardy creatures. But as we looked further into this, we noticed shimmering water near the rocks and the octopus, and we took water temperature, and it was like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So there were these warm water vents coming out of the base of this, essentially as an extinct volcano, or so we think, and it's providing an environment that's warm enough for not only octopus to be there, but octopus that are brooding. These are octopus that are sitting on their nests, brooding these these nests, and they do that. They sit on these nests for about 2 years. It's cold, dark environment. It takes a long time. And then once all the eggs are hatched, the females die. But this is, and you can see some of them have turned themselves inside out because that's the way they protect their brood. So we noticed little baby octopuses being hatched and floating away. We noticed some shrimp that were trying to eat the little babies as they were coming out. It was just a remarkable area. And this area was just, there were thousands, too many to actually count. The second only discovery like this in the world. There was a deep sea octopus kind of garden area off the coast of Costa Rica that was discovered 5 or so years ago, 10 years before this, but there were no brooding octopus there. They were just deep sea octopus, and that water was warm enough to support them. So this was truly spectacular, and I think this octopus garden story got like millions of media hits when it first came on the scene, and we've since been back to look at this area. And so just a great example of things that we do to help tell the really interesting, fascinating story of the ocean that most people would never have a chance to see or understand. Another really cool deep ocean example is in 2019, also at the Davidson Seamount, even in deeper water, around 10,000 feet deep, we came across a whale fall. This is a whale that dies and sinks to the bottom, where an otherwise pretty devoid area, the seafloor usually in these areas are kind of like a desert, right? There's not a lot of life on the seafloor, but when these whales hit the bottom, boy, the animals come from everywhere to feed on the carcass. And what was interesting about this one was that we discovered a new species of bone-eating worms. If you can see these, kind of like the beak of the whale has this pink, reddish, looks like grass growing on them, but these are a species of bone-eating worm called Osidax. And this was a new species of Osidax that was discovered just by coming across kind of really a needle in the haystack of finding this whale fall, which leads to all kinds of cool discoveries and findings. So I wanted to share that with you. I think I've got one more example of making a difference. Next slide. Yeah, so we have instituted this vessel speed reduction program on the West Coast, Central Coast of California, to address a really tragic occurrence that happens with whale ship strikes. There have been 82 recorded ship strikes on whales in California since 2007. There have been 51 recorded ship strike fatalities on endangered whales since 2007. So that comes out to about 4 recorded ship strike fatalities per year. And those are just the ones that we see or are reported. We know that there's more going on. And so to address this, we thought, what are some ways in which we can help mitigate this and minimize fatalities by whale, ship strikes. And so through some careful study, through Soundscape, by putting out buoys to find where whales tend to congregate, and monitoring that over time, and also doing more real-time monitoring of where the whales are. We know where the ships are because they stay within the vessel traffic lanes. So how do we minimize these strikes? Well, the best way to minimize it is to slow the ships down. If you can slow the ships down, whales have a chance to get out of the way. The ships have time to make evasive maneuvers if they see whales at the surface feeding. And so we put in a voluntary speed reduction program and ask ships and shipping companies to please slow down, especially in certain areas where we know that whales tend to congregate. And so it's been really successful. This is just from last season, 18 global shipping companies and about 560 ships participated, slowing down a total VSR distance of 180,000 nautical miles of slowing down. And what's really interesting about this too, you have the side benefit of emissions reductions, which is really critical for especially the Los Angeles, Ventura County, and even the San Francisco Bay Area, where we have lots of air pollution. That when you slow these ships down, you get a lot of air emissions benefits. So 650 tons of smog forming NOx and 22,000 metric tons of GHGs as greenhouse gases were reduced by just slowing these ships down. Also, another benefit is that you reduce the noise in the ocean as well by about 5 decibels per transit. And so we've seen about a 50% reduction in ship strikes on whales through just slowing the ships down. And so I just wanted to share that as a way in which sanctuaries work with lots of partners, including even the shipping industry, to address, serious resource protection issues. Thanks. Yeah, toss it to
All right.
LeAnn.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I am also going to talk a little bit about resource protection, our damage response and restoration efforts at the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. One of the main challenges at Florida Keys is vessel groundings. There are hundreds of groundings every year, and they mostly impact the seagrass beds and the coral reefs. As you can see there in a couple of those pictures with the circles, that is seagrass scars, and then vessels running aground on the coral reefs. And so once the damage occurs to these sites, we have a damage assessment team, multiple teams that get on the water as soon as possible so that they can go out and assess the damage to the resources within the sanctuary boundaries. And so once those the damage is assessed, then the restoration team can pull together plans for how they're going to restore the damaged seagrass or corals. So it's a multi-step process. It also involves a lot of partners. We work with Florida Wildlife Commission, state partners to get both the damage assessment and the response done. The sanctuary is often impacted by more than just vessel groundings. You see this large red buoy in this picture. This large red buoy came unmoored and from somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico and collided with a tract of coral reef. And so while a lot of the teams at Florida Keys are not only involved in restoration, a lot of what goes into the damage response is removal. So they do coordination of removal of vessels, marine debris, buoys, and other hazards that come into the sanctuaries that can harm the natural and cultural resources within the site. So this is a huge effort, and it is constantly ongoing because of all the hazards that can come into, and just also the sheer number of people that are in the Florida Keys and using the area. That's it. That's all I got.
Well, thanks, Paul and LeAnn. That was really interesting, and I learned something on that. Okay, so now let's turn to system expansion. So as I mentioned before, in the mid-90s, we deactivated our site evaluation list. We did not have the ability to designate new sanctuaries, but it came time where we had been managing the existing sanctuaries, and it was really time to think about what's next for our program. So we evaluated how we did it before, and I will say that there was always been a fair amount of controversy in designating sanctuaries with the role of the federal government coming in. I still have scars from my Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary designation process. So we shifted this. So rather than NOAA coming in and saying, okay, we have this list of places generated by a panel of experts, let's have it be grassroots. So we call it our sanctuary nomination process, and communities, and that's very broadly defined. It can be a state, it can be an environmental organization, it can be a indigenous nation or tribe, submits a nomination to NOAA that addresses a number of criteria, including national significance, opportunities for partnerships, and such. And then those nominations that we accept get placed on our inventory. So what we want to do next is just talk about some of the new sites that we're working on. But first, I'll tell you about a couple other things. So a little out of order. Okay, next slide. Okay, so expanding. We do have expansions to our existing sanctuary. Thunder Bay was initially 480 square miles, and it is now 4,300 square miles in Lake Huron. This is the more recent one, the Flower Garden Banks, that we expanded it to protect an additional 14 reefs and banks. And typically what we do in, thinking about sanctuaries, our regulations or expansions, is looking at the threats. So, adding these new banks to the Flower Garden Banks was addressing threats such as, fishing, bottom tending gear, anchoring, oil and gas exploration, and such. So that's a pretty recent expansion. Okay, we have a couple new sanctuaries. One of them is the Mallows Bay Potomac River, yes, in the Chesapeake Bay, not what you would typically think about as a National Marine Sanctuary. And this is like about 100 World War I era wooden steamships that's known as the Ghost Fleet. I think one of the advantages of this site is it's just outside of Washington, D.C., and we've been able to bring a number of members of Congress and elected officials and people to show firsthand what we can do. Even in a site that's in the Chesapeake, focused on maritime heritage resources. Next slide. The most recent designation is Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast. And this is based on maritime heritage resources. So it's now the second Great Lakes National Marine Sanctuary. We're starting to build a network in the Great Lakes. Okay, so next we'll talk about the three of them that are in designation status. And I'm going to turn it back over to Paul to talk about the one that he's heading up.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. So yeah, I'm super excited to talk to you about Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. That's something that's been taking up 90% of my time since really last summer to now. We're on a fast pace to try to get this designated in the next year or so. This is a really fascinating and beautiful stretch of coast along the San Luis Obispo and northern Santa Barbara County lines. It's about 156 miles of coastline, about 7,000 square miles of ocean that's been proposed for sanctuary designation. These are nationally significant resources. It's a really interesting area where you have the California current that's comes down the entire length of the West Coast. And right along this stretch of coast, it mixes with the Southern California bight, warmer water. So you have this transition zone occurring around Point Conception. And this area just explodes with sea life. They're just the amount of sea life in here is just it's rivals any other place on the coast or anywhere in the world. And there's some really special geomorphological features like the Santa Lucia Bank and some canyon structures that we're really excited to get into and explore. And there's about 200 historic shipwrecks that are also along this coast that we would love to explore and tell those maritime stories as well. So it's a dynamic coast. There's a lot going on. And we are all, like I said, we're on a fast track to get this sanctuary designated. Get the next slide, please. So the proponents of this sanctuary, this is the Sierra Club, Surfrider, and the Northern Chumash Tribal Council. They identified numerous threats to the area's marine resources. So they just what sanctuaries do, they're seeking a mechanism for comprehensive ecosystem-based planning, which sanctuaries do, to address a myriad of threats. Oil and gas development, there's also oil and gas platform abandonment going on in this area. There's often seismic survey testing related to the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, which is supposed to be decommissioned in the next 10 years. There's offshore wind and wave energy development. There's the big Morro Bay wind energy area that is not within the sanctuary, but just offshore. But that power that will be generated in that wind energy area will come through the sanctuary in subsea energy transmission cables. So we'll have a lot of wind and wave energy development along this stretch of coast. This is where most all of the fiber optic cables that cross the Pacific come to shore. So we've got lots of fiber optic cables on the seafloor, an area that's experiencing coastal erosion ocean acidity, really at the forefront of climate change and the effects of climate change. And there's been this, waxing and waning here and then gone, but always this potential discharge of Central Valley wastewater that gets proposed and pulled back and proposed and pulled back. So these were things that the proponents identified that they really thought a national marine sanctuary could come and help address these myriad of issues. Next slide, please. And then what's really unique and special about this proposed sanctuary is the opportunity to highlight indigenous heritage and culture. So these are some of the oldest recorded human occupation in North America, Chumash and Salinan coastal sites. The Northern Chumash Tribal Council focused on Chumash culture, but we really want to make sure that all tribal bands and interests are included. There's great ideas here for highlighting diverse indigenous culture through educational programming, through exhibits and signage, learning about paleo shorelines, resource protection programs that can protect archaeological sites, and really looking at a more collaborative management approach to involve indigenous communities and tribes in ongoing sanctuary management. So we're really looking forward to that. I've been having great dialogue with Chumash bands in this area, and really looking forward to working closely with them when this sanctuary gets designated. I think, is that the last slide? Yes, so I'll toss it to LeAnn.
Great, excellent, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about proposed Hudson Canyon National Marine Sanctuary. The Wildlife Conservation Society, the New York Aquarium, submitted this nomination in 2016, and they recognize that this area of the waters off of New York and New Jersey were special. Obviously, sustaining a world-class metropolitan region, very rich maritime history, highly productive fisheries. It truly is an ecological hotspot because of the canyon, which is the largest on the Atlantic coast. You have these areas of upwelling and a lot of marine mammals transiting the area. So it is a very important place. A lot of recreational and commercial fisheries in this area, very important area for them. And one of the things that I would say that also makes this area special is there is no other national marine sanctuary in this area. There is Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, and then the next one in the Atlantic Ocean is Gray's Reef. So I think it's very good that we're considering a sanctuary in the Mid-Atlantic region that brings with it very unique opportunities for outreach and education in the region. Next slide. So one of the things that we did a little bit differently with Hudson Canyon is because of this area of the ocean, as you can imagine, it's off shore of New York City, New Jersey. This is a really busy area. We have shipping, submarine cables, wind leases, commercial fishing, a lot of things happening in this area of the ocean. And it is typical that a nomination will propose boundaries and recommend boundaries when they submit a nomination. The Wildlife Conservation Society did have proposed boundaries, but we decided to start from a very neutral position with this designation. And so we went out with no proposed boundaries because we truly wanted to get public input on all the things that you see there on the slide when we did our public scoping, which was in the summer of 2022. And so we wanted to hear from the public about their ideas on boundaries, the location and the value of the natural and cultural resources. And so we held in-person and virtual meetings to get public input. And so with this brought a really rich and exciting opportunity to engage with the users of this area and such as the recreational and commercial fishers. Next slide. And so because we are very, very early on in the process here, I just wanted to give you a general sense of what we heard when we did engage with the public. And, you know, there was very strong support for the proposed designation. And LeAnn talked a little bit about sanctuary advisory councils. There was a very strong support for pre-designation sanctuary advisory council in this area. Even those that were maybe opposed to the idea supported this so that there could be more community involvement and more voices on the idea. And so we had a lot of good recommendations for boundaries, which is great because that's why we started the way that we did when we went out to announce the designation. And so where do we go from here? We are working right now on establishing the Sanctuary Advisory Council. We have solicited applications for membership and we're reviewing those. We're working on engaging with indigenous nations and tribes in the area. We are, throughout this whole process, have continued and will continue to engage with fishing interests and the fishery management councils in the area, and then also begin drafting our designation documents. That's where we are.
Okay, well, I will bring us home. The last one we'll talk about is Eastern Lake Ontario, which is the last proposed sanctuary we'll talk about today. So this nomination was submitted by 4 counties in Lake Ontario, the city of Oswego, and there was support from the state of New York. Because all Great Lakes waters are state waters, you know, the governor is, you know, we in essence co-manage state water sanctuaries with that state. So that was important to get support from the governor. This proposal was focused on maritime heritage resources, shipwrecks, historic artifacts. But you know, the more I learn about this area, it's just incredible. And I find that, you know, now I think about Lake Huron and Lake Michigan as like, you know, the newer shipwrecks because, you know, the history in this area goes farther back. Next slide. We are very interested in working with the indigenous nations and tribes called the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And as you can see, I hope you can see on this on these maps that, you know, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, those are their ancestral lands, and they are no longer there. I'm working most closely with the Onondaga Nation, and they don't have a presence on Lake Ontario, but we're, you know, they're interested and we're interested in, you know, reestablishing that connection. So, you know, that will be an important part of this designation process. Next slide. So our proposal is to, you know, recognize the national significance of this area's historical, archaeological, and cultural resources, and to manage it as part of the National Marine Sanctuary system. Now, when I talk about the, you know, the maritime heritage, I guess I need to, I don't know, explain myself that the maritime heritage sanctuaries go well beyond just focusing on maritime heritage. And I mentioned before that sanctuaries are places where researchers come together to assess. So there's a lot more going on. And ultimately what we want is for people to learn about the Great Lakes and to become better stewards. So we do a lot of outreach and education on just the Great Lakes ecosystem. Next slide. So this, we just published our proposed rule for the sanctuary. This is the area that we proposed in our rule. It's the area that was included in the original nomination. So Eastern Lake Ontario, and that's the St. Lawrence River that connects to the Atlantic. It's about 1,700 square miles. Next slide. In our draft environmental impact statement, we included an alternative that included the Thousand Islands region of the St. Lawrence River. There are a lot of reasons that we wanted that, including recreation opportunities, many more known shipwrecks. We could have more active management of those shipwrecks. But we heard loud and clear from the shipping community and from the federal agencies that are charged with managing the St. Lawrence and providing safety that they were not thrilled with the idea of us including the St. Lawrence. So we didn't. So our proposed rule is only Eastern Lake Ontario, which I think is, I think makes sense in terms of, focusing our resources on the original area. And, the Thousand Islands is already a place where a lot of tourists go to. And, Oswego is less of a place for that. Next slide. So our draft management plan, like, management plans for all the sanctuaries, covers a wide range of topics, including, better understanding the area, exploration, discovery, which, Paul talked about, an example in Monterey, education, stewardship, and tourism. Next slide. Okay, so in our proposed rulemaking, as I mentioned, we selected our preferred boundary. We also have our proposed prohibitions or, our regulations that manage and protect the resources. So this is our typical one, there can be no damage to sanctuary resources. And that one is very similar to New York state law. So not a lot of value added for that, except for enforcement purposes. The two that are new to this area are prohibiting grappling hooks and anchors at shipwreck sites. It is not a good practice on wooden shipwrecks to drag an anchor into a shipwreck. We also have this prohibition in the new Wisconsin shipwreck coast. But we have to look at this in the context of our management plan, and our intent is to install mooring buoys. So in effect, this prohibition becomes, not important because the users at the shipwreck sites will just attach their boats to the mooring buoy. And then this last one is the prohibition of tethered underwater systems. Really, we mean ROVs, but it's not our intent to prohibit them. It's our intent to administer a permit system. Many of the shipwrecks in Lake Ontario are very deep. So the threat to those are less from the diving community, but more from explorers, people, wanting to see the shipwrecks using ROVs, and the tethers, the cables can get caught up in the standing masts. So we will see what happens, what kind of comments we get on this. I am heading to upstate New York on Monday, and we have 3 in-person meetings next week, and then we have 1 virtual one the following week, and then our public comment period concludes on March 20th. We are hoping to finalize this designation in a year. I mean, in essence, we just need to finalize our documents, get it through the review process. So we're excited. It's really meaningful that we would have a 3rd Great Lakes sanctuary. There are a lot of stories to tell, sharing assets among, the NOAA Great Lakes sites is really beneficial. And you look at the shipwrecks and their stories, whether it's, a ship that was built in Oswego and sank in Wisconsin shipwreck coast. So excited about that. So that is a thumbnail sketch of where our program is going, how I think we've evolved from the early days of how we designated sanctuaries, moving more toward a community-based nomination, and over time building up the number of sites that we have. So I couldn't end our presentation on a notice of proposed rulemaking. So here are a couple of nice slides, but next slide. I think we are finished and would be very happy to answer any questions that you have. Okay. Well, I'm going to start off with a question for one of my colleagues, if that's okay, while you guys are thinking about.
Sure. Well, let me just say, if folks want to use a feature to raise their hand, they can do so. If they do want to come on camera during a silence, they're welcome to. And if they're a little camera shy, you can type questions in chat.
Looks like Tom has a question. I think I saw his hand raised, Tom. Oh, Tom, you're on mute. Oh, Tom, we still can't hear you. I'm asking to unmute. See if you see something.
Oh, I see. Oh, well, you can type it in the chat, Tom. How about that?
Sorry about that.
And Ashley, you can probably stop sharing the screen.
Okay, sounds good. I think so.
Okay, well, while Tom is trying to figure it out, I'm going to ask my colleague, Paul, what regulations are you proposing for Chumash Heritage?
Well, because we are in the rulemaking, things have not been cleared yet. Can't really go into the details, but I think what I tell people is, look at the Monterey Bay regulations, look at the Channel Islands regulations. You'll get a good sense of what's most likely to come out. I think for the California sanctuaries, it was important for us to have some consistency in the regulations from Cordell Bank, Farallones through Monterey Bay, Channel Islands. So you'll likely not see much different, but I can't really go into the details just yet.
Okay,
we hope to publish in April. So when we say designation documents, I should clarify what that is. It's a draft EIS. So what is the impact of the sanctuary to existing human uses? It's a little bit different way of doing NEPA, but that's what the action is. And then we have to do a proposed rule, which are the regulations. And then there's a draft management plan. And so all three of those documents essentially make up the designation documents. And then we'll publish those and have a 45 to 60-day public comment period. And then from there, it takes us about a year, hopefully less, to finalize everything. So that's kind of how we make the sausage kind of info.
Well, as long as we get Lake Ontario designated before Chumash, I'll be fine with it. A little friendly competition. No, that's interesting, Paul. And I totally see why you'd want consistency in the California sanctuaries. I guess I think about it a little differently in the Great Lakes, that I see an evolution. And I saw, with Thunder Bay, we had just really basic regulations. And, based on our threats analysis and kind of pushing the envelope a little bit, trying to have some more tools for resource protection.
So Tom, you may be off mute now if you want to say something. Oh yeah, you're not muted, but we can't hear you. So it might be a microphone issue. Let me ask LeAnn, in terms of the flow of the basically the number of nominations that come in and the processing, what is the rate limiting factor? What is the pace at which these sanctuaries are designated, and how do you ultimately prioritize which ones are moving forward? It sounds like in some cases, as Paul noted, there's maybe a fast track for certain ones where there's a higher risk to the resources.
That is a great question, how we select to move forward with certain sites and not others. I'm trying to think, how many do we have on our inventory where we're not moving forward? Maybe 3? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good guess. Maybe 3 or
Yeah.
4.
Right. So it certainly is a function of resources. It's very resource intensive for us to go through the designation process. I mean, it's years of staff time. And I think there's, just a recognition that some sites are higher priority to designate, whether it's, geographic representation, whether it's, a better fit for our system. I mean, there is language in the appropriations bill that we should move forward with the sites on the inventory. So we haven't ignored that, but, there really is only so much we can do. And there may be more sites that are, more nominations that are coming into us. I mean, I'm working with some communities in the Great Lakes region, and my personal goal is to get a sanctuary, an ecological sanctuary in Lake Superior. So I hope that we get a successful nomination, and I hope that we initiate a sanctuary in Lake Superior.
I might just add, I think another spark sometimes is a requirement that we have to do a 5-year review. So for example, when Chumash was first accepted as a nominated sanctuary, it was put on our list in 2015. So we were required in 2020 to do a 5-year review to see, is this still a viable proposal, or that, what new information is there that might need to be addressed. And so as a result of that 5-year review and public comment period on the 5-year review report, overwhelming response. This is still very important. We heard that loud and clear from the public, and that was really an ignition to get this thing going. And when we did the notice of intent in November of 2021, we got nearly 30,000 comments, which was many of those were support letters and sign-on letters, but a lot of interest. And so we knew we were on to doing the right thing because of that 5-year review.
Good point. So I see that Tom put a couple things in the chat. Yes, he was involved in Gray's Reef, Keys, Flower Gardens. Okay, 45 years ago. Okay, so you're dating yourself, Tom. There was very little work on fishing. So in terms of research or managing? And I'm trying to think what, yeah, well, that's always, that's always a tough one, because we are, different from the National Marine Fisheries Service. LeAnn, I'm going to let LeAnn answer that one.
Sure. And I am going to answer this one in the context of proposed Hudson Canyon. And what I will say is that one of the things that the nominators, WCS, pointed out in their nomination is that they recognized that the fisheries in this area were very well managed by the Fishery Management Councils and the Atlantic HMS Management Division. And so they recommended that the fisheries continue to be managed by those management authorities. And so they set that kind of right from the ground in the nomination. And so that has led, which is great, has led to very positive interactions. I mean, there's still some nervousness from the fishing, both recreational and commercial fishing, about authority and the Sanctuary Act authority and Magnuson Act authority. And we do have to go through a process where we call it 304A5. It has to do with a section of the Sanctuaries Act, where we do consult with the Fishery Management Councils and NOAA Fisheries when we're going through designations. And so we tend to agree with that, that sentiment in the nomination, but we do have to go through that consultation process as we're going through designation. So.
And I would, I mean, I think so there's fisheries management, but there's also habitat. And I think our role is stronger in, managing and protecting habitat. I mean, in the Great Lakes, it's a state managed resource, so we would not have a role But I have encouraged the nominators to think about the potential for, addressing threats to habitat, which would improve fisheries. So Norfolk Canyon was under the old system on the site evaluation list. And yeah, I think there was a designation process started, but that's long gone, and we are not considering that. And I'm not aware that anybody is interested in proposing Norfolk Canyon as a sanctuary.
Sorry, wrong symbol there. I wasn't congratulating the lack of designation. Meant to raise my hand. So now that I'm there, one thing as we come up on the hour, Ashley, if you could post that survey link in the chat, that would be great. Appreciate your feedback on the session today. But Ellen, I wanted to ask, we can stay on a few more minutes if you, Paul, and LeAnn are willing.
I am,
Right.
yeah.
Great, thanks. In terms of, you touched on this, the enforcement aspect, once the regulations are in place at these various locations, it sounds like it varies, but can you kind of explain, once it's designated, who's in charge of making sure that that those are enforced?
Well, I'll first give a Great Lakes example and then maybe hand it over to Paul to talk about the West Coast. We have a recently hired NOAA enforcement officer in the Great Lakes, one person who covers the entire basin. So, there's not a lot of NOAA enforcement. We really rely heavily on the Coast Guard, partnership with the Coast Guard, and to a certain extent, our state enforcement officers. We're thinking in Lake Ontario that we would establish a joint enforcement agreement where NOAA would financially support the state to enforce sanctuary regulations. But it's definitely, it's a partnership approach, and few NOAA enforcement officers.
Maybe
Yeah,
LeAnn can. Oh, sorry, Paul.
That's certainly the case. We rely heavily on NOAA law enforcement, so it's a separate wing within NOAA for boots on the ground, so to speak. But as Ellen mentioned, we rely also heavily on U.S. Coast Guard and our state enforcement partners. In California, we have a joint enforcement agreement with the state fish and wildlife officers, and so they are deputized. They can actually write tickets that for Sanctuaries Act violations. But a lot of what we do in enforcement is community-based enforcement. It's more education and outreach. And we've set up, programs where volunteers, for example, we will have a couple of programs. One's Team Ocean, which are volunteers that go out in kayaks and boats and interact with the boating community and talk about the resource and the sanctuaries and what you can and can't do, and wildlife viewing guidelines. Similar with Baynet, or volunteers that are hanging out sort of where people tend to hang out on the coast along bike paths and viewing areas, and set up binoculars and telescopes and talk to the public. So we do a lot of education outreach on our regulations. For example, meeting with pilots and pilot organizations to talk about our low overflight regulations and things like that. So we rely on a whole host of tools to essentially enforce the regulations.
Very good. I'm kind of curious, maybe LeAnn has a sense of, as she looks at the Hudson Canyon and looking to the example to the north at Stellwagen, when I look at the fisheries tracking data, there's a very distinct line that outlines exactly where those boundaries are, where the fishing vessels will go right up to the edge and not go into it. So presumably, hopefully it's because they know and respect the boundary, but I wonder if there is much enforcement activity at that boundary.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that on-water enforcement, like Ellen said, that is something that we rely on the Coast Guard for, especially on offshore sites. But one thing I want to say is that fishing occurs in probably 98% of the sanctuary system. So there are very few cases where, and very specific cases where recreational or commercial fishing is not allowed, and it's usually gear-based. Ellen talked a little bit about it in flower gardens, like bottom tending gear, things like that. So, but your point about lines on a map and enforcement, there are some times when there are seasonal and rotational closures and research areas. And so the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement works very closely to enforce not only NOAA fishery regulations, but also sanctuary regulations. And so they have both of those acts and others to enforce. So as you can imagine, that's a lot. And so there's not, like Ellen said, a ton of enforcement agents. So they do the best they can. And the partnership with the Coast Guard, especially in the offshore areas, we couldn't do it without the Coast Guard helping. Yeah.
I had one other question for LeAnn as well, related to the Hudson Canyon proposed National Marine Sanctuary. You mentioned that some of the feedback you heard as well was related to compatibility with the offshore wind industry, and I was just wondering if you could speak a little more to that and kind of what you've heard in that process.
Yeah, that has been a major component of the public input. So when the sanctuary was nominated in 2016, the New York Bight lease areas that have now been leased were not there. So they have since been proposed by BOEM, the wind energy areas, and leased by specific companies. And there is one of those leased areas that overlapped the proposed nominated boundaries because of the timing of those two things. So as you can imagine, the wind energy industry is very interested in the designation and working with us on input on boundaries. And so we consider, we've been working also with BOEM and having a partnership with BOEM. And so there are some jurisdictional issues when it comes to wind and sanctuaries. And so those, we also work closely with BOEM on those. And so it is an issue that will kind of continue to be in the forefront as we move forward with Hudson Canyon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions out there? We are 5 past the hour. We can stay on longer, but we certainly appreciate everyone's time so far. All right. Well, I think we can wrap it up then. I appreciate it very much, Ellen, Paul, LeAnn. That was certainly a great presentation, and my request for some amazing pictures was satisfied. Great visuals there, and great work that you're all doing. Also appreciate everyone for calling in today, participating, and for the questions and the discussion.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It really was great.
And feel free to follow up with any questions if you'd like.
Absolutely. Okay, again, reminder to take the survey if you can. Otherwise, you all take care and hope to see you on the next session.
All right.